He thought he could judge someone by their skin color. He looked in the mirror, saw a black man in the back seat, and shut off the engine without another word. What started as a routine ride turned into a moment of pure humiliation, just not for the man he expected. Because the truth about his passenger was something he never saw coming. It was a humid Wednesday morning in Atlanta, the kind where the heat settles over the city like a heavy blanket. The streets buzzed with activity as commuters rushed to work, deliveries sped down narrow lanes, and car horns played a familiar urban symphony. William had just wrapped up a business breakfast at a downtown hotel. Dressed simply in a dark charcoal t-shirt and jeans, he looked like any other professional catching a quick ride to his next meeting. He opened the rear door of a silver sedan, part of a rideshare fleet, and quietly took his seat behind the driver. The man at the wheel wore a faded USA baseball cap and a weathered gray shirt that clung slightly to his neck in the rising heat. His name was Eric, and he greeted William with a quick glance toward the rearview mirror and a casual question about the destination. But the moment he got a proper look at the man in his back seat, his entire tone shifted. His eyes hardened, his lips pressed together. Without warning, he reached for the ignition and turned the car off. The sudden silence in the vehicle was louder than the traffic outside. William, puzzled, leaned forward slightly. Eric didn't turn around. He didn't explain. He simply said he wouldn't be driving him anywhere. Confused, William asked if there was a problem. That's when Eric muttered something about not driving certain kinds of people. It wasn't just the refusal that stung. It was the calm, casual cruelty in his voice. The way he said it like it was just policy, like it made sense. As if William's skin color was a valid reason to be denied a seat in a car he had paid for. The two men sat there, the air growing thicker between them. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. But in that moment, something deeper had been set into motion. What Eric didn't know, what he never even considered, was that the man he had just dismissed wasn't just another passenger. He was someone who had the power to end his shift permanently. And the wheels of that reality were already beginning to turn. Eric finally turned around, his face stiff, with a smirk that barely hid his contempt. He gestured toward the door with a nod, like he was doing William a favor just by speaking. He said something about how people like him always expected special treatment. William held his gaze but didn't move. He calmly asked again why he was being told to leave. Eric's tone sharpened. He said he didn't drive for certain types, didn't trust them, and didn't care about whatever app had assigned the ride. He mumbled something about crime rates, then added that he didn't want any trouble in his car. His voice grew more aggressive with every word, emboldened by the idea that he had the upper hand. He even laughed a little, shaking his head as if the whole situation was ridiculous. But William didn't flinch. He sat there, calm but unmoving, watching this man unravel with his own arrogance. And then, with deliberate precision, William began to speak. He didn't shout. He didn't match Eric's hostility. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions. What kind of people did Eric think he was referring to? Why did he assume he had the right to refuse service based on appearance? What gave him the authority to rewrite company policy from the front seat of someone else's vehicle? Eric tried to talk over him at first, brushing it off with sarcasm and muttered stereotypes. But the more William spoke, the more Eric's confidence started to erode. There was something in William's voice, something practiced and composed, that didn't fit with the assumptions Eric had made. He wasn't just calm, he was used to being in control, and that control was starting to seep into the space between them. The balance in the car began to shift. The driver was now on the defensive, and the passenger, the one he thought he could dismiss, was quietly dismantling every excuse he threw forward. Still, Eric clung to his prejudice like a life raft. He doubled down, refusing to start the engine, refusing to apologize. He said he didn't care if the ride was canceled or if he got a bad rating. Nothing was going to make him drive that man anywhere. At least, not yet. Because the next thing William said would shake everything Eric thought he knew, not just about the man in his back seat, but about who really owned the road he was driving on. The air in the car seemed to still as William leaned forward, his voice lower now but firmer than ever. He asked one simple question. "Do you know who owns this vehicle?" Eric scoffed. He muttered something dismissive, claiming he leased it through a fleet contract and that it was part of a network. He named the rideshare company, said he didn't need to know who owned what, just that he drove for them. William nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket, not in anger, not in haste, and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he opened an internal dashboard. A sleek app interface lit up the screen. Tabs labeled Fleet Management, Driver Performance, and Operational Violations appeared clearly. He turned the phone just enough for Eric to catch a glimpse, not to flaunt, but to clarify. He asked again, this time more directly, if Eric was aware that this specific car, in this exact zip code, was part of a company called Vertex Mobility. Eric hesitated, his jaw tightened. He said, "Yeah, maybe." That sounded familiar. William nodded once. He told him that Vertex Mobility was one of several transportation companies he had built from the ground up over the past 9 years. That he currently oversaw operations in 12 states. That this very Carth, one Eric had proudly refused to drive, was not only leased under William's corporation, but managed by a team that reported directly to his executive board. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't thick with tension anymore. It was hollow, like something had fallen out of place. Eric turned slightly, the weight of what he'd just heard pulling his mouth open but offering no words in return. He tried to process it, scanning William's face again, this time not with judgment, but with the slow, dawning realization that he had made a massive mistake. His confidence drained in real time. The hat on his head, the casual bigotry in his tone, the smugness he had carried like armorite, all began to feel very small, very misplaced. Because the man he thought he could throw out of his car was, in fact, the very reason he had a car to drive at all. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't celebrate the moment. He just let the truth sit there, like a mirror that Eric could no longer look away from. And in that mirror, the reflection was brutal. Eric sat motionless, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, though the car wasn't running. His mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to defend himself, explain it all away, but nothing came out. There was no explanation that would make sense now, no excuse that would undo the things he had said. The man he had judged in seconds, the one he thought he had power over, was now clearly the one with all the power. Not just in theory, not just in status, but in the very structure of the business. Eric depended on every single day. William didn't gloat. He didn't scold. He simply tapped one more option on his phone screen and said Eric's driver ID out loud, confirming it with quiet precision. There was no threat in his tone, just clarity. Eric asked, almost whispering now, what William was going to do. William didn't answer immediately. He just asked a final question that cut deeper than anything else. He wanted to know if Eric still thought he was the kind of man who didn't deserve a ride. That question didn't need an answer, because the answer was written all over Eric's face. Shame, embarrassment, fear. The car, once a space of control for Eric, had become a cage of his own making. As the minutes passed, William calmly stepped out of the vehicle. He stood outside for a moment, looking out at the street, letting the warm breeze pass through. Then he turned back to the car and simply said that someone from his operations team would be in touch. No threats. No yelling. Just a quiet assurance that actions have consequences. Within the hour, a regional manager from Vertex Mobility had flagged Eric's account. His access was suspended pending internal review. William hadn't demanded it. He hadn't needed to. The system he had, built brick by brick, policy by policy, was designed to protect passengers from exactly this kind of abuse. And now, it was protecting him. News of the incident made its way through internal chat threads and regional reports. Word spread fast, not because of outrage, but because of who it had happened to. Employees were stunned. Drivers were texting each other screenshots. Most had never seen the CEO in person. Now they realized he wasn't sitting behind a desk in some distant office tower. He was out in the streets, experiencing the service they delivered firsthand. Not only did it change how they viewed him, it changed how seriously they viewed the rules. William didn't just teach a lesson to one driver that day. He sent a message across an entire fleet. And as for Eric, his world had turned upside down in under 10 minutes. Not because he made a mistake, but because he revealed exactly who he was when he thought no one important was watching. Turns out, someone was. As Eric sat alone in the driver's seat, the weight of the last few minutes began to settle on him like cement. The silence in the car, once something he controlled, now felt suffocating. His face burned with a mix of anger and shame, though he didn't know who he was, more furious with William, the man he had just insulted, or himself, for not seeing the storm he'd invited into his own car. He stared at the dashboard, at the now dark screen of his app, trying to process what had just happened. The realization that this wasn't just a passenger, that this man actually owned the entire structure Eric worked under, hit harder by the second. The app refreshed. A red banner flashed across the top. Driver access temporarily restricted. Awaiting internal review. He tapped it frantically, scrolling through policy links and terms of service, looking for a loophole, a number to call something. There was nothing. The control he'd once felt behind the wheel had been yanked away, replaced with an automated process that no longer needed him to say anything. His choices had already spoken. Elsewhere, William walked down the block with steady steps. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't fuming. There was no need. He checked his phone again, not for the app, but to answer a text from his assistant confirming his next meeting. Business moved forward, and so did he. He didn't need to post about it. He didn't need to make a scene. The power of what had just happened was already echoing in the right places. Back at Vertex Mobility headquarters, the compliance department had already flagged the incident. William's direct involvement had triggered a fast-track protocol that normally took days to process. His name on the file turned everything into priority status. HR received a copy of the incident within the hour. The driver ID, the route details, the timestamps all matched. There was no question about what had happened. Meanwhile, some of the local drivers in the Atlanta network started hearing rumors. Someone said the CEO had just been kicked out of his own company's car. Someone else replied that the driver was done for. A few even double-checked their own profiles, making sure they had no passenger complaints in their history. The shock wasn't just that William had been mistreated. It was that he had shown up in the system like any other rider. No special warning, no VIP tag, just a man getting into a car, trusting a system he had built to treat people with dignity. And that system had failed. For a moment. But only for a moment. Because the response had been swift, measured, professional. The exact opposite of how Eric had acted. And now, that contrast was becoming clearer by the minute to everyone who mattered. By the next morning, Eric's name was circulating through more inboxes than he ever imagined. A formal investigation had been opened by Vertex Mobility's compliance team, and the audio logs from the in-car system had already been pulled for review. Though Eric had assumed the conversation ended in that car, the truth was more complicated. Company policy mandated silent logging of every ride for liability reasons, and his voice sharp, dismissive, layered with prejudice had been recorded in full. The review team didn't need hours to deliberate. Within 10 minutes of listening, they heard enough. The tone, the refusal, the racial language, it all confirmed the violation. And not just of company policy, it was a failure of human decency. A senior VP forwarded the file to William directly. He didn't ask for it, but they felt he deserved to know. William listened. Just once. That was all he needed. He didn't write back with rage or demand termination on the spot. Instead, he simply replied with one sentence, "Let the policy speak." That was how William led. No revenge, just structure. His team knew what to do. Meanwhile, Eric had tried to recover. He called the support line, demanding someone explain why he was locked out. He claimed it was a mistake, that there had been some glitch. But when he finally got through to someone in driver services, the tone on the other end of the line was cool, professional, and final. They confirmed his case was under review for discriminatory behavior and that someone would follow up within 72 hours. Eric tried to push back, tried to explain, tried to say it wasn't what it looked like, but it was exactly what it looked like. And now, his driver history had a stain that wouldn't be erased. Word spread across internal Slack channels and driver groups, not just about the incident, but about how William handled it, calmly, privately, with power that didn't need noise to be felt. Drivers who had never met him started referring to him with new respect. Not just the CEO, but the kind of leader who lived the values he wrote about in memos. People paid attention to that, especially those who knew how often power usually insulated itself. Eric's file was passed to legal for a final compliance decision. He wasn't fired yet, but everything was moving in that direction. And the most painful part for him wasn't even the likely termination. It was the knowledge that he'd burned everything down with his own words. In less than 10 minutes, he had thrown away his job, his reputation, and the fragile illusion that no one would ever call him out. Now he knew better, and the silence that followed was louder than anything he had said in that car. The internal review was nearly complete when someone in the PR team flagged a potential escalation. A local blogger in Atlanta who often covered labor stories had caught wind of the incident through a third-party driver. No names were named, no identities confirmed, but the headline was already making rounds. Black CEO denied ride by his own company's driver. The article was short, speculative, but the details matched too closely to be coincidence. Comments started stacking up, with some users furious and others doubtful. But the damage to Eric's anonymity was already done. Even without his name being published, employees in the rideshare network recognized the pieces: the date, the time, the city. And the biggest clue of all, the man in the story wore a USA hat and refused to drive someone based on skin color. Eric's persona, which had once blended into the background of rideshare drivers, now stood out like a spotlight. Screenshots of old posts he had made surfaced in group chats. Some included veiled political statements. Others revealed a subtle history of bias that no one had cared about until now. Suddenly, people were connecting dots. Internally, HR held a quiet conference with legal, operations, and corporate affairs. The consensus was unanimous. While Vertex Mobility had no interest in making a public example out of Eric, they needed to act decisively to maintain credibility. William was informed that the team was ready to proceed with termination. He didn't interfere. He simply reminded them to follow every protocol exactly. No shortcuts, no personal exceptions. That was his quiet form of justice, letting the structure work, even when it was his own dignity on the line. At noon, Eric received an official email. The subject line was sterile: notice of termination. The body was direct. It cited violation of anti-discrimination policy and irreparable breach of service standards. His account would be permanently deactivated. Final payments would be processed in accordance with contract terms. No appeal, no review. He was out, just like that. And the worst part was, there was no one else to blame. As the story continued to circulate online in whispers and threads, employees across Vertex Mobility's offices felt something shift, not just in procedure, but in culture. They saw that the values listed on the company's homepage, diversity, equity, respect, weren't just words. They had been tested, and they had held. All because one man chose to stay calm in the face of ignorance. And that calm, backed by quiet authority, had triggered a storm the other man never saw coming. In the weeks that followed, the company didn't release a statement. William never posted about what happened, but something far more powerful began to unfold, quietly, steadily, and from the inside out. New internal training modules were launched, focusing on unconscious bias, passenger rights, and zero-tolerance policies for discrimination. These weren't surface-level workshops slapped together for PR. They were deep, scenario-based, and pulled directly from the reality of what had happened in that Atlanta car. Every regional hub was required to participate. Every driver had to sign new ethics agreements. And across break rooms and dispatch centers, the tone began to change. People weren't just checking boxes anymore. They were talking, reflecting, thinking twice. At one Memphis training site, a young driver stood up and asked a question no one expected. He wanted to know if the story was true that the CEO had really been profiled in his own car. The instructor paused, then nodded. No names were given, but the confirmation was enough. The room went silent. Some people looked stunned, others uncomfortable. But everyone understood the message. This wasn't just a hypothetical lesson. It had happened, and it could happen again, unless they made sure it didn't. Meanwhile, William moved forward, as he always did. Focused, disciplined, unshaken. He made no effort to turn the incident into a symbol, but it became one anyway. Within the leadership team, the story became an inflection point. Quiet discussions were had about reevaluating how field staff were recruited, how values were communicated from the top down. A few VPs even volunteered to do ride-alongs not for show, but to truly understand the passenger experience. And in driver forums, people who had once rolled their eyes at sensitivity policies now approached them differently. They remembered the Atlanta incident not as a threat, but as a wake-up call. Because if someone as powerful as the CEO could be mistreated, then the system clearly wasn't bulletproof. But more importantly, they saw that leadership cared enough to fix it. Eric, meanwhile, disappeared from the platform. No other rideshare company hired him. His profile was quietly blacklisted across multiple fleets, not out of spite, but because his actions had revealed something too ugly to ignore. And in an industry where trust is everything, that stain doesn't wash off. William didn't follow up. He didn't look back. He had no interest in dragging out the humiliation. His goal had never been revenge, it was accountability. And that goal had been met, completely, quietly, permanently. Months later, as the weather cooled and Atlanta slipped into its slow southern winter, Eric made one last attempt to claw his way back into the system. He had stayed off the grid, living on short-term gigs and avoiding questions about what happened. But the silence had grown unbearable. One morning, he showed up unannounced at a Vertex Mobility Support Center, dressed in a wrinkled jacket, holding a printed letter in his hand. It was a plea not for forgiveness, but for reinstatement. He claimed to have reflected, to understand now what he didn't then. The letter was polite, formal, filled with the right words, but something about it rang hollow. The woman at the front desk recognized his name immediately. She didn't react with hostility, just professionalism. She took the letter, nodded, and let him know that someone would be in touch. As he left, she forwarded it to corporate. The legal team reviewed it first. They saw no new evidence, no signs of changed behavior, only a man trying to undo the consequences of his own exposure. They forwarded it to the ethics board. Same conclusion. Finally, it landed with William. He didn't respond publicly, but quietly, internally, he gave his answer. Let the decision stand. Redemption, William believed, wasn't about getting your job back. It was about who you choose to be when no one's looking. And the day Eric had a chance to show faith failed. It wasn't just about one racist outburst. It was about a man so comfortable in his bias that he treated a stranger as beneath him without ever imagining there could be consequences. And now, those consequences were permanent. Inside the company, the moment became a story people told behind closed doors, not out of gossip, but as a reminder, a warning. It was shared with new hires during orientation, not with names, but with clarity. That one of their own had once disrespected a passenger so deeply, and that the passenger turned out to be the one person who could end his career with a single choice. People paid attention. The culture changed. Not overnight, not loudly, but undeniably. Because the story was no longer about one man's ignorance. It was about a system that refused to protect it, and a leader who refused to let it slide. Time passed. The story faded from whispers in back offices to a lesson sealed into company culture. William never spoke publicly about that day. No interviews, no headlines, just quiet progress. He continued building Vertex Mobility with the same principles that had carried him from startup scrappiness to national dominance: efficiency, respect, and integrity at every level. The Atlanta team eventually moved on, hiring new drivers, implementing better training, refining policies to prevent incidents like Eric's from ever happening again. No statues were built, no grand speeches made. But in subtle ways, William's presence was felt more than ever. He was seen taking rides in different cities, unannounced, sometimes speaking with drivers afterward, sometimes not. Not to monitor, but to stay close to the heartbeat of what he had built. The riders never knew who he was, and that was the point. Respect shouldn't depend on recognition. It should be automatic. Across the company, the internal story was still told not to shame, but to reinforce. One careless moment from one man had nearly fractured the trust thousands had worked to build, and one calm response from another had restored it. In the industry, competitors took notice. Other rideshare companies began updating their training programs too, quietly following Vertex's lead. The incident that had nearly gone viral turned into something far more powerful: an invisible standard. Something people tried to live up to, not just talk about. And as for Eric, he remained a ghost in the system. A file marked closed. A reminder of what happens when someone believes they're above consequences, only to discover they were speaking to the very person writing the rules. William didn't need revenge. He didn't need to prove his worth. His calm had spoken louder than outrage ever could. His silence had carried more weight than confrontation. In a world that moves fast and forgets even faster, he had done something rare. He had left a mark that no one could see, but no one would forget. And that, in the end, was the truest form of power. If this story made you think twice about how we treat people when we think no one's watching, then share it. Because dignity doesn't wear a name, Tagand power doesn't always dress like you expect. Hit that like button if you believe respect should never come with conditions. And subscribe for more real stories that challenge what we think we know. The smallest moment can reveal the biggest truth.